Sir, you can't be here dressed like that.
I'm cleared. I'm late for a meeting.
That uniform doesn't match this facility.
I have my ID right here.
That card could be anything. Where did you get it?
It was issued with my orders.
Orders from who exactly?
Not from anyone you report to.
I'm asking you again, who's your supervisor?
The office that signs for the Pentagon.
The interaction took place outside a federal administrative complex on a weekday morning. It was not a military base and not a public street, but a shared-use facility where civilian offices, contractors, and visiting officials passed through daily. Security in this area relied on routine patrols and spot checks, not controlled gates. Officers were instructed to challenge anything that appeared out of place. The man in dress whites had arrived just after 9 a.m. He parked in a visitor-designated area and began walking toward the main building. His uniform was formal and precise, the kind worn for official meetings, not ceremonies. It stood out, but it was not prohibited. Visitors in uniform passed through the complex several times a week. The officer who stopped him had been on duty since early morning. Earlier that week, supervisors had circulated reminders about credential misuse and impersonation cases reported in other districts. The guidance emphasized awareness, not confrontation. Officers were told to verify credentials carefully, especially when something didn't fit the environment. When the officer noticed the dress whites, the first assumption was that the man was either at the wrong location or attempting to gain access through appearance alone. That assumption shaped the rest of the exchange. The officer did not recognize the insignia or the cut of the uniform. It did not resemble the service dress commonly seen at nearby installations. The man responded calmly and directly. He did not raise his voice or argue. He explained that he was attending a scheduled meeting inside the building. When asked for identification, he produced a government-issued credential tied to his assignment. The card was legitimate but unfamiliar. It did not match the formats the officer encountered most often. Instead of verifying the information through the listed channels, the officer questioned the card itself. This was not unusual. In many routine encounters, false credentials are obvious within seconds. Here the difference was subtle. The card did not look fake. It simply did not look familiar. The setting contributed to the confusion. The area was quiet, with cars moving in and out and employees walking past without paying attention. No one appeared alarmed. The absence of urgency made the stop feel routine, even as the verification process stalled. Procedurally, the next step would have been to contact a supervisor or use the internal system to confirm the credential. That step did not happen immediately. Instead, the officer continued asking clarifying questions, attempting to reconcile the uniform, the ID, and the location into a familiar pattern. What was missing was recognition that some assignments operate outside local command structures. Certain roles report directly to federal offices in Washington, bypassing regional oversight entirely. These roles are designed to move quietly through civilian and military spaces without drawing attention. The misunderstanding did not escalate because of hostility. It escalated because of delay. Each unanswered question reinforced the original assumption. Each minute without verification made it harder to reverse course. By the time the officer asked who the man reported to, the interaction had already drifted from routine to unresolved. And without realizing it, the officer had paused a person whose authority did not require local approval at all. Before that morning, the man had built a career around staying unnoticed. His work did not involve public ceremonies or press briefings. It involved coordination, review, and decision-making across agencies that rarely worked in the same room. His role required familiarity with military structure, but also with civilian systems, legal constraints, and interdepartmental protocols. He had spent more than 2 decades in service, moving between operational commands and administrative assignments. His evaluations were consistent, reliable, detail-focused, not someone who sought authority through presence. Colleagues described him as efficient and reserved. He arrived early, left quietly, and documented everything. Promotions came steadily, not rapidly, and always followed periods of extended responsibility. The position he held at the time of the incident was not widely understood outside a narrow circle. It placed him in an advisory and oversight role connected to defense policy implementation. He did not command troops. He did not issue public orders. His authority came from delegated responsibility, formalized through written directives rather than rank alone. Because of this, he often moved between spaces where his uniform raised questions. He wore dress whites when attending meetings that involved senior officials or formal review sessions. In less formal settings, the uniform looked out of place. He was aware of this and usually carried multiple forms of identification to avoid confusion. There had been a prior incident several years earlier. At a regional facility, a contractor questioned his access badge during a late evening meeting. The situation was resolved quickly after a call to security. No report was filed. The moment passed without consequence, and it did not change how he approached future interactions. He did not view such moments as personal challenges. To him, they were procedural interruptions. He expected systems to correct themselves once the right information was checked. That expectation shaped how he responded when questioned. He stayed calm. He waited for verification. His reputation reflected that approach. Supervisors trusted him to handle sensitive material without supervision. Subordinates respected his consistency. He was not known for confrontation, and he was not known for invoking authority unless necessary. On the morning of the stop, nothing about his preparation differed from routine. He reviewed his notes, confirmed the meeting location, and left with enough time to arrive early. The uniform was required. The identification was current. From his perspective, there was no reason to anticipate a delay. That assumption, that systems would function as designed, would be tested not by resistance but by uncertainty. The sequence began without urgency. The man entered the parking area, followed posted signs, and parked in a space marked for visitors with temporary credentials. He shut off the engine, gathered a thin folder from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the vehicle. Around him, traffic moved in slow patterns. A delivery truck idled near the loading dock. 2 employees crossed the lot, talking quietly as they walked. He adjusted his jacket and started toward the main entrance. The building was already active, with doors opening and closing at regular intervals. A security vehicle rolled past at a steady speed, then slowed. The officer inside noticed the uniform as the vehicle passed and circled back. The officer exited the vehicle and approached from the side, not blocking the man's path but positioning himself close enough to speak. The initial question was neutral, asking whether the man was visiting the facility or worked there. The man answered that he was attending a scheduled meeting and continued walking at a reduced pace. The officer asked him to stop. The man complied and turned slightly, keeping his hands visible. When asked about the uniform, he explained that he was on official business. The officer requested identification. The man reached into his inner pocket and removed a credential holder. The gesture was slow and deliberate. Still, the officer interpreted the pause as hesitation. The man opened the holder and presented the card. The officer took it, looked at it briefly, then looked back at the uniform. The 2 details did not align with the officer's expectations. The officer asked where the man was assigned. The man gave the name of an office that did not include a local unit or base. That answer created a gap. The officer asked for clarification. The man repeated the office name and added that the meeting was time-sensitive. A radio call crackled nearby. Another patrol passed without stopping. No one else engaged. The officer glanced toward the entrance, then back to the man and asked him to wait. The man shifted his weight and stood still. He did not reach for his phone. He did not ask to leave. He watched the officer examine the credential again, flipping it once before handing it back. The officer's next question focused on authorization. The man explained that his orders covered access for the day. He offered to provide a contact number. The officer did not take it. At that point, the interaction had slowed traffic only slightly. People continued to enter and exit the building. The situation was contained, quiet, and unresolved. The officer had not decided to clear the man, and the man had not yet been told he could proceed. The misunderstanding had settled into place, not through confrontation, but through a pause that lasted longer than expected. The officer returned to the same question, phrased slightly differently. He asked why someone with that assignment would be entering through a public access point. The man explained that the meeting had been scheduled there and that he had followed the instructions provided. He kept his answers brief and consistent. The officer nodded but did not respond. He looked again at the uniform, then at the building. His focus remained on what did not fit. He asked whether the man had any additional proof of authorization. The man said he could provide the meeting confirmation or call the office arranging it. The offer was declined. A woman exiting the building slowed as she passed, glanced at the 2 men, and continued on. She did not stop. The moment passed without comment. The officer stated that impersonation cases were taken seriously and that misuse of military appearance was a concern. The statement was delivered evenly without accusation, but it carried weight. The man replied that he understood and repeated that his credentials were valid. For the first time, there was a pause where neither spoke. The man stood with his folder held against his side. The officer shifted his stance and adjusted his radio. The surrounding noise continued, engines, footsteps, a distant alarm from inside the building, but the space between them felt contained. The officer asked for the man's full name and date of birth. The man provided both. The officer wrote them down but did not confirm how they would be checked. The man asked whether a supervisor could be contacted to resolve the issue. The officer said he would handle it. That response marked a change. The man's concern was no longer about being late. It was about the process itself. He asked carefully whether verification would occur through the credential system. The officer replied that he was still assessing the situation. Another minute passed. The officer repeated that the uniform did not make sense in that setting. The man clarified again that his role involved oversight and coordination, not local command. He kept his tone steady. The officer stepped back slightly and instructed the man to remain where he was. The instruction was not loud, but it was firm. The man complied. For a brief moment, he considered calling his office himself, then decided against it. He did not want the situation to escalate through competing channels. The fear that surfaced was restrained and specific. It was the fear that delay would be mistaken for defiance, and that the longer the stop continued, the harder it would be to correct. The situation remained calm, but the balance had shifted. Verification had still not occurred. The supervisor arrived several minutes later in an unmarked vehicle. He approached without urgency, already reviewing information on a handheld device. The officer met him halfway and spoke quietly, gesturing once toward the man waiting near the walkway. The supervisor asked for the credential. The man handed it over without comment. This time, the card was examined against the system used for interagency access. The supervisor paused, entered additional information, and checked a second database. The change was immediate but restrained. He looked up, then back at the screen, and asked the man to confirm his office and purpose for the visit. The man repeated the information he had already given. The supervisor nodded once. The supervisor turned to the officer and asked when the credential had been scanned. The officer did not answer right away. He said he had been assessing the situation. Supervisor asked again, more directly. The officer admitted it had not been verified yet. The supervisor completed the check. The screen displayed the assignment, authorization window, and reporting structure. The man's role was listed under a Pentagon-level office that operated independently of regional command. Access for the day had been approved in advance. The supervisor's posture shifted. He handed the credential back to the man and addressed him by title. His tone was neutral but precise. He stated that the verification confirmed the information provided. The officer stepped back and adjusted his belt. He avoided eye contact. The supervisor asked the officer to stand by and made a brief call, confirming that the meeting contact had been notified of the delay. There was no announcement, no visible reaction from passers-by. The resolution occurred within a few sentences. The supervisor apologized for the delay, framing it as a procedural error. The officer said nothing. His earlier certainty had narrowed into silence. The supervisor instructed him to return to patrol and remain available. Before leaving, the supervisor asked the man whether he wished to file a report. The man said he would handle it through official channels. The interaction ended as it had begun, quietly. But the verification had revealed something the officer had not anticipated. The man had not been subject to local discretion at any point. The authority had always been there. It simply had not been checked. Within 48 hours, an internal review was opened by the department overseeing security for the complex. The review focused on procedure, not intent. Body camera footage was requested. Radio logs were pulled. The timeline was reconstructed from arrival to resolution. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. This was standard protocol when a verification failure involved a federal credential. The leave was not disciplinary at that stage. It restricted duty while the review progressed. The man submitted a written account through his office. The report was factual and brief. It listed times, statements, and the lack of credential verification. It did not request punishment. It requested clarification of process. Supervisors identified a gap. Officers assigned to the complex were trained primarily on local and regional identification formats. Interagency credentials tied to independent federal offices were covered only in supplemental materials. The expectation that officers would recognize them on site was unrealistic. A policy bulletin was issued. It required immediate system verification when presented with unfamiliar credentials, regardless of appearance or location. The bulletin emphasized that uncertainty was not a reason to delay confirmation. Media attention was limited. A trade publication covering Defense Administration mentioned the incident in a short report about interagency access issues. No names were published. No footage was released publicly. The officer returned to duty weeks later after completing additional training. The review noted procedural error and failure to escalate for verification. No further action was taken. The man attended his meeting that day and the ones that followed. He did not change how he traveled or how he dressed for official business. The outcome did not hinge on apology or confrontation. It settled into manuals, checklists, and training modules. The impact was measured not in statements, but in revised steps added to routine practice. Situations like this do not begin with hostility. They begin with patterns. In security and law enforcement work, officers rely on repetition to make fast decisions. Most of the time, that approach works. Uniforms usually match locations. Credentials usually look familiar. When something breaks that pattern, uncertainty fills the gap. Bias in these cases is not always personal. It often shows up as reliance on what is commonly seen. When an officer has encountered dozens of false credentials that look one way, anything different can trigger suspicion. The problem arises when suspicion replaces verification. Systems are designed to account for unfamiliar roles. Databases exist because not all authority is visible. When those systems are bypassed, judgment becomes subjective. The risk is not embarrassment. The risk is delay, misclassification, or escalation that could have been avoided. This incident illustrates how rigid assumptions can override simple procedural steps. The officer did not lack access to verification tools. The tools were present but unused. Training emphasized awareness but did not reinforce response when awareness turned into doubt. There is also a structural issue. Many interagency roles are intentionally low profile. Their effectiveness depends on mobility and discretion. When frontline personnel are not fully briefed on how those roles appear in practice, friction becomes inevitable. The lesson is not that officers should recognize every credential by sight. That is unrealistic. The lesson is that uncertainty should trigger confirmation, not control. Verification is not a concession. It is the system working as intended. Small decisions made quietly shape outcomes. In this case, the absence of a single step extended an interaction and created consequences that reached beyond the moment. Understanding that process matters more than assigning blame. Have you ever experienced a situation where assumptions about authority or credentials caused confusion? Maybe it was at work, in a public space, or during routine procedures. We'd like to hear your perspective. How do you think these situations could be handled differently? What steps would ensure verification without escalating unnecessarily? Share your experiences in the comments. We're interested in real examples, not just opinions. If you found this story informative, consider following the channel. We cover real-world cases with careful investigation, focusing on procedure and consequence. Your feedback helps shape future episodes and encourages discussions about systems, bias, and clarity in professional settings. Stay engaged, ask questions, and join the conversation. Your input adds depth to how we understand these everyday misunderstandings.